We're going to have about 4 short interludes from old friends and colleagues of Peter's that's going to try and capture the spirit of what we all feel and love about the great man. So first of all, one of his oldest friends, known him for over 50 years, I'd like to introduce David Shipley.
Hello everybody. Extraordinary experience standing here and trying to give some kind of view of what a great person Peter was and what a dear friend he was over 50 years. But I'll just sort of run through some of my memories. And, I did say earlier that you should never share a stage with children or animals, and nothing like that you shouldn't share with professional stand-up comedians. So one of those is coming along later. Hope you enjoy that. Peter and I went back a long way in 1965 when we started Dr. Chalmers Grammar School in Amersham. I'm delighted to see Heinz and Sam and Ian, anyone else from our year at the school, and also our maths teacher, Graham Hall, who was an inspiration to us. My first memory of Pete is seeing his name on the board as the fastest person at the school cross-country course, as a result of having longer legs than anyone else at age 11. I didn't really get to know him until we were put in the top maths set in the 4th year, and we bonded over a childish sense of humour and a cynical approach to authority. It was a shining example of the fact that you didn't have to choose between being a teacher's pet and doing badly in exams. You could challenge authority and still come top in everything. It's a great lesson. People here might not be aware of the fact that he was a gifted artist, and perhaps his finest hour at school was when he drew a set of larger-than-life caricatures of nearly all of the teachers. I think Graham got off because he liked him too much, mocking their attempts at discipline. Although, of course, he got perfect results on the exams, and he played cricket and hockey with impeccable chivalry and barely controlled violence. He also taught himself the guitar, and one summer we found him building a dry stone wall in his mother's garden. There was nothing he couldn't turn his hand to. We had an exceptionally bright group of people, and 7 of us went off to Oxford together, which was unheard of for a modest-sized grammar school in those days. Pete, of course, got a scholarship, or as they say at Magdalen College, a demyship. It's one of those things at Oxford. Normal words don't mean what they seem. According to the college's founder, William of Waynfleet, those scholarships were intended for poor scholars of good morals and dispositions, fully equipped for study, which is a wonderful description of Pete. He was poor at the time. He's one of the most ethical people I've ever met in my life. I don't think he ever did a thing for a bad reason. And throughout his life, he fitted that description perfectly. And that's more than you could say for something like Oscar Wilde or George Osborne, who were also dead. At Oxford, he was the scourge of the Magdalen Park football table. He strongly held views about ethical play, woe-betide people who spun the rods or hacked one. We spent many happy hours listening to Bob Dylan or Peter Green's Fleetwood Mac, not the later version, or Jimi Hendrix or the Velvet Underground on repeat play on his little dulcet. I think we listened to Sister Ray, which is 17 and a half minutes long, 7 times in a row. Early in our working life, we went to the Rainbow in Finsbury Park to see Winston Rodney, aka Burning Spear, and we stood out from the other Rastafarians in the audience. Having gone in our suits straight from work. Pete was completely unfazed, and people next to us were happy to share their refreshments. He also showed his extraordinary capacity for work as a student by achieving a high first, and his extreme unselfishness by allowing me to cram at his digs in the hope that some of the magic would rub off. It did, and so he helped me to avoid the the ignominious result that 3 years of idleness would richly deserved. He seemed destined for a life of great distinction in the academic world, moving seamlessly from chemistry to mathematical physics and putting forward big ideas about fundamental questions of physics. We can only speculate what Peter could have achieved in physics with his restless intellectual curiosity and superhuman energy. But financial reality cut in and Pete moved to Arthur Anderson to become a consultant. They packaged him up with Roger Townsend, who I'm delighted to see is here, and sent him to the then shambolic C.T. Bowring, in the hope that they could drag Bowring's antiquated systems into the 20th century. Pete did such a good job that Bowring, who had recently been taken over by Marshall McLennan, first hired him and then tried to send him to New York to sort out the mess in Guy Carpenter's processing systems there. But by this time, Peter had met Annie, the love of his life, and started a family, so he was in no mood to move to the USA. They don't have cricket there, so that would have been a deal breaker on its own. I was able to persuade my colleagues at Murray Lawrence and Partners that he was the man to sort out what was perhaps an even bigger mess at our underwriting business. Unfortunately, it was a case of don't mix business with pleasure. It was a hospital pass on an epic scale, as the mess was really only a symptom of some horribly dysfunctional things going on in the business. And although he made major progress, eventually he had to give up. He was rescued by David Mann, who took him into a much more congenial atmosphere than what was then D.PHIL. David and his successor at what became Faraday, Rolf Tolley, had a much better understanding of Pete's great intellect than some of our colleagues did at Murray Lawrence, and of his huge problem-solving capability. As well as allowing him to create very powerful processing and reporting systems, they saw his advice on underwriting and strategic issues. And this was kind of a pathway for Pete back into the world of academia and the sort of raw intellect that he liked the best. In particular, he became an expert in modelling potential losses from windstorms and earthquakes. And as ever, he was full of insight and rigorous logic. He also had some pretty clear ideas on how Lloyd's could turn its systems from a liability into an asset. And this is talking about over 30 years, but unfortunately successive CEOs really didn't want to know. He was the best, in my view, the best IT director the market never had. So, as it is for all the alphabet soup of initiatives and tens if not hundreds of millions spent on consultants and projects that went nowhere, we still have messy, low-tech premium and claims processing systems. Meanwhile, his clearly expressed solutions like gathering dust on shelves. I had a look through my email correspondence with Pete, and he was so articulate and uninhibited in expressing himself that it felt as though he was still in the room with me. I think I've got 750 emails from him. For someone as erudite, intense and well-informed, but at the same time emotional as Pete, it was inevitable that he'd be the master of the rant. As Capital confirmed Pete's tendency to righteous fury could be entertaining and challenging at the same time. But reading through the emails, they're actually pretty measured, and also light. His particular targets were bluffers, and Pete really didn't go much on people who, excuse my French, bullshit. From earliest days, a great term of abuse is bullshit! really got on his nerves if anybody got beyond their knowledge and started to try and con him. He didn't like climate alarmists. Pete, I have to say like me, was a climate skeptic. The difference between him and me is that he actually understood physics. And people would argue with him that clearly had no idea of physics, but that thought that by disagreeing with him he was somehow evil. And get quite excited about that. And worst of all, what he didn't like was people that played games and sought to manipulate. He's utterly 100% honest, straightforward, incapable of telling a lie, and completely altruistic in his motivation. In some ways, like and subsequently Oasis, are testament to that, in that some of us might have been more cynical about building those things and being open source and giving markets through some else might think didn't necessarily deserve access to these treasures. There are no shortage of people from peak to Venice spring and our treasures so that is entertaining. The other thing that leaps out is his extraordinary appetite for knowledge, appetite that remained undiminished in his fine illness. He was constantly working on theories of uncertainty, basic methods of addressing moral weaknesses, 101 either scientific, philosophical, and statistical ideas that were way over the heads of most of us. In his long train journeys, he read book after clever book and recommended them to any of his friends he thought had a chance of understanding them, usually overestimating our powers of concentration and of intellectual curiosity. Having helped Rolf and after that Henry, Lord Ashton, set Faraday on a very successful path, he felt it was time to retire. By this time he and Annie had moved up to Lincolnshire, and the plan was to do much less insurance-related work and focus more on his academic interest in risk, the nature of knowledge, and the quantification of uncertainty. But of course, he couldn't choose. He did both and drove himself to the limit, commuting between Oxford and Lincolnshire and London in this sort of constant trial. He was a research fellow at what is now called the Oxford Martin Institute for Science and Ethics, and produced papers for them and organised conferences. Only someone with Pete's drive and intellectual self-confidence could rock up at over 50 years old at Oxford and throw himself into academic life there after a career in insurance. Just the sheer self-confidence and self-belief was extraordinary. At the same time, he and Dickie established Oasis Risk Network, which then became the Oasis, who are our gracious hosts here. I'm sure Dickie had something to say about that. He made repeated forays into exchanging to try and help deliver the projects that Lloyd so badly needs. And on top of all this, on a personal note, he was a dedicated trustee and a wise counsellor to my wife Nita and myself in our charitable trust. On several occasions, he was able to guide us through difficult decisions that we had to make, and as usual, he applied altruism and logic in equal measure. At each stage of Pete's career in the insurance market, he was a friend, mentor, and guide to countless people. He was always generous with his time and went out of his way to be kind to young, talented people who'd been overlooked in favour of those who perhaps were better at self-projection. I'm sure there are lots of people here who've experienced that and are reasonably grateful. As I've hinted in some ways, in many ways, his time at D.P. Mann Faraday was a golden era of Dave. So it gives me a lot of pleasure to hand over to another old friend, both Peter's and mine, a man who rescued him from Horizons Partners, Peter's old boss, the apprentice David Mann.
Phillip Taylor was an extraordinary man, which makes it very easy to say nice things about him.
He was one of the most hard-working people I have ever met. But mainly because nothing seemed like hard work to him. The intractable problems were devoured like beaten potatoes. He enjoyed intellectual challenge so much that tough things were just easy. His intense energy and enthusiasm and forethought was simply a joy. In my view, very few people are gifted to touch others in a way that changes a person, and so changes their aspirations and their future. Peter had that gift to influence people and influence their lives. He wasn't just a mentor. Perhaps he could be described as a serial mentor. However, he was not a diplomat. He spoke now, and though he was usually right, he spoke the truth as he saw it regardless of outcome. of anything but the denial of what he saw as the right course of action. Hedging of bets, pussyfooting around an unpopular issue was not Peter Taylor. His words were always charged with passion and conviction. And more than the odd expletive in whatever company he was in, ignorance and the negativity of bureaucracy exasperated him and were his sworn enemies. Yet Peter needed a certain freedom to generate and express his unique energy. Perhaps because our organisation was quite small, we were lucky enough to be able to benefit from his creativity in ways that perhaps a large company would struggle to achieve. He sought perfection in what he did, and it seemed to me not for any material gain. Money was just a means to an end for him. He wanted to make right what he viewed as wrong. I think he was an unashamed utopian with a strong moral and ethical compass to guide. He hated anything he judged in any way as dystopia or dysfunction. And he said so, usually quite loudly. Some might say he was a gentleman of a different age. However, I would say he was a true professional with a great gift of foresight and most definitely of his time. He wasn't only drawn to abstract and intellectual concepts that many of us, certainly me, would find hard to grasp. He looked inwards, outwards, everywhere for his observations and thoughts on life. He was, in my opinion, a natural-born searcher, a seeker of truth, a restless. As such, he was up for discussing any subject whatsoever and delivering his instant, usually insightful views in a way that stimulated any meeting. These instant insights sometimes were brilliant, even bordering on genius. To horribly misquote the song by David Bowie, I think Peter was a hero for more than one day. For he brought his intensity and passion to improve things into his daily life with an endless inquiry. It was my privilege to know him as a colleague, but mainly as a friend. He exuded an integrity you could actually feel when in his company. Many years ago, a book greatly impressed me. Its title was The Meetings with Remarkable Men. Peter Taylor would be in my book of Meetings with Remarkable Men. When I last saw him, he knew his remaining time was measured in weeks. In that last meeting, I saw a man living that sunset time so bravely and so well, and with a smile on his face. Now we have another friend and colleague of Peter, Mr Sheehy, Executive Director of Capsicum Marine.
Love insurance, don't you? I won't keep you long because I know your glasses are looking a bit empty at the moment. It's very kind of Annie and Dickie to give me a platform in this age where people have no platform for controversial views, and I'm going to be controversial because everyone else has spent a lot of time being nice about him. It's about time we heard the truth, I think. Most people remark on Peter's intellect, but my question is, if he was so bloody clever, what the fuck was he doing in insurance? The insurance insurance, chances you know it'd be the Paralympics of financial sector. I remarked to Marcus Scriven, who printed it somewhere, that all he needed at the time to join us was O-level woodwork. And he turned out with a double first in maths and physics and a doctorate, slightly overqualified. His son has reminded me that at his retirement, I said a few words on his behalf, and his son reminded me, which I'd forgotten but I did enjoy for myself, was that he was the Poundland Stephen Hawking. He never made anything simple, and his doctorate thesis was an attempt at a unified theory of everything. It was a work of which he was justly proud, and he was kind enough to share it with me and gave me a copy, which I find very handy still, because I keep it at home and I pretend I understand it, nod sagely if anybody asks me a question. He invented a title for himself when he was working there, Chief Information Officer, because he got fed up with people asking him to fix their PCs. And apparently the trick is to turn it off and turn it back on again. He championed systems modelling with a level of intellectual obsessiveness that would classify him as a nerd in other social circumstances, except he had the social skills that went with his brain power. So I think that he was a geek before geek was chic. And he was also a master of fashion, because the hipster hadn't been invented. The hipster who wears their clothes ironically from the past. And those unpleasant ties that he used to wear, such as the one I'm wearing today to commemorate him, he used to wear them with a straight face and pretend that they were fashionable, rather than that it was a little joke we all knew. So this isn't hideous, it's a mark of respect. He did flee the corporate culture of C.T. Baring being absorbed by Marsh, and I was surprised to hear from David that Guy Carpenter used to have problems with their back office systems. I'm sure they've sorted that out now. He did end up fleeing to a small independent agency called Mann, and it was one of the few places in the market that cherished weird people, which is why I was allowed in briefly. In fact, in that entity, Peter was one of the only normal ones, which shows you how strange the place was. I was lucky enough to share an office with him, and my enjoyment was behind every day, because there'd be an emotional roller coaster, and if I had a really good day, I'd see him smash a keyboard or a telephone or something, and something to look forward to when he came in the morning. He applied that same binary emotion response to people as well, and many of those who work with here and trained so many people, mentored so many people, but I used to love his judgment of people, because people are either the best employee ever or a complete idiot. Usually the same person on the same day. So I saw him as the opposite of Goldilocks. Nothing was quite right. Everything was too soft, too hard, too hot, too cold. I'm going to miss his enthusiastic endorsement of a new book, which I never understood. He'd read it the night before, he'd give it to me, and he'd say, "You must read this, it's a fascinating theory, you'll really enjoy it." And I think, well, I'll leave it a bit, because he'll probably change his mind by next time I see him. So I don't have to bother. And anyway, I wouldn't have understood it, but I used to pretend I did. The other reason not to get too involved with his brain was it went so fast, so that I swear that after lunch, and it was a big long lunch, and Mr Shippers was there, I heard him turn round to David Shipley in the afternoon at the cricket and say, "A nightly, David." But Peter threw himself into everything with a passion, and it was that passion that produced those swear words that we mention so often, and they punctuated his presentations and his discussions, and I think that it was that alienated him from the American culture, because, funnily enough, on the other side of the channel they're more offended by those swear words, and he often directs them at the senior individuals in the organisation, usually deservedly so. But I was lucky enough to see Peter towards the end when he was in the hospice in Lincoln, and he put on a very brave face for the day when we dragged him out to the pub, and we argued, we laughed, we debated, he informed us, and we tried to disagree with him but were unable to, which would be a typical excellent lunch for Peter. Then at one point during lunch he did cry. He then apologised to us for spoiling the atmosphere, because he thought we were there for the meal rather than for him. And I think that is typically Peter. He never slowed down, he never rested, and I don't think that gave him the chance to understand how much people really loved him. So his illness was nasty, brutal and swift, but I think it gave a number of us the opportunity to tell him exactly how much we did love him and how much he meant to us. So he will be missed.
Given the fact we've had three old friends give their recollections of Peter, I deliberately made mine relatively short because I knew they were going to be somewhat derivative. But I wanted to bring some of the time I've known Peter, even though I've known him for quite a long time. I was going to refer to 3 or 4 things that struck me about Peter, which we are going to see a common theme, obviously. And I'm going to sort of use the last 4 years that he and I spent particularly developing Oasis as the sort of the ground from which I'm going to sort of talk on this. So the first thing is we've all talked about so much, it's obvious because you can't fail to appreciate it when you're in the room with Peter, is his intellect. And I'm glad maybe pinched all my baselines. But one of the things he used to occasionally say was that it started early when he was at school. He won the prize for service to the meteorological and weather machine that was in the grounds of the school. And it's been mentioned that his math teacher is here. What I learned this morning was at one stage when he didn't turn up for class, Ian, who's also here in school with him, they carried his teacher into the classroom. I have to say that I know many people who carry their maths teacher in the classroom. I certainly would not think an expert, of course, you wouldn't do that sort of thing. But quite extraordinary when he would do that. When we started Oasis, one of the other founders of Oasis, Paul Mann, who's here, said, we have this great idea, why don't we build this open source cat model platform? And about, you've been saying this at the conferences for a couple of years. And I remember going to see Paul and sort of asking about exactly what he was trying to achieve, and then sort of went, you can't do that, it's impossible. And Peter also did the same thing. He said, well, of course, a lot more basics than the next broker, but he sort of said, no, you can't do that, it's impossible. And we sort of all got together, and somehow or other decided it was possible. And he did say to me once, he said, and he'd say this, we'd probably say this once a year for the last 4 years, he'd say, Dickie, you know, this comes into the hard cap, don't you? So what I learned to understand was, in the hard cap, is otherwise translated as impossible for mere mortals. And pretty difficult for Peter and the talented team that he built around him to help him business. So he, like others, I was lucky enough to see him in the hospice in England. And he said to me there, he said, just as I left, he said, you do realise, don't you, that I'm not an academic? Which I sort of went, yes, I think. You know, he said, I'm an intellectual. And I hope there aren't too many academics in the room. Because he said, academics usually do derivative work based on somebody else's previous work, whereas intellectuals think independently and really create a new sort of paradigm. And I think that does say a lot about him. He did once walk into the office and looking rather pleased. The trouble is, there weren't too many people he could talk to at the same level. I think at that particular time there were some very more numerically strong people in our team. I think I was the only one there. He said, Dickie, can you ever guess what? He said, I've just found a fantastic new way of handling correlation. Well, I do have an appreciation a little bit about how that can be useful, but I couldn't quite have it, let's say, there was enthusiasm he did. So I did my best to sort of go, oh, great, fantastic, that is brilliant. And you can clearly see that I didn't really understand what he was talking about. And then 2 days later came back in looking crestfallen. He said, I can't believe it. just